my passion and my focus has shifted over the past decade from those American-focused and domestic issues to the issues that affect Israel and affect the country where my father was born, where most of my family lives, and which so many of my people consider to be the national homeland of our people. And the passion that I bring to these issues is driven by the connection that I feel deeply and personally to the heritage and the history of the Jewish people, and to my own family's place in the history of the State of Israel and of the Jewish people generally. So I started the book by laying out in the first few chapters what my family's story is. I start primarily with my father's family, which moved in the 19th century, in the 1880s, from Russia to Palestine. My great-grandparents were in the very first wave of the first Aliyah, the first ascendance to Israel. There were only several tens of thousands of Jews who moved from Russia to Israel in that wave of immigration, and my family was part of that. They were part of the original settlers, when that word didn't have such a negative connotation, of Pt.1, which is today an industrial suburb of Tel Aviv, but at that time was an agricultural settlement in a swamp off of a river called the Yarkon. And my grandparents were one of the 60 families that helped to found the city of Tel Aviv, which at that point was a garden suburb of Jaffa. And middle-class families like mine from Jaffa, my grandfather was a watch repairman, and they didn't have enough space to live in and to raise a family, and they wanted a little bit more room, and they created a suburb called Tel Aviv. It was the first Jewish garden suburb before there was Long Island, and before there were a whole host of the suburbs around here. There was Tel Aviv. And I talk about their role. I talk about my great-grandparents and what they were hoping to escape and to find. And I talk about my father and his role in the right-wing Zionist movement. For instance, he was the commander of the Beitar youth movement in Jerusalem. He was a very close associate of Menachem Begin. He was very close to Bibi Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion. This is the environment that my father was raised in and came from, and he was very involved in the rescue of Jews from Europe. He was sent to Vienna in 1938 to help run illegal immigration operations there, and then ended up in the United States to help raise money for the Irgun, not only for its illegal immigration operations, but also for its fight against the British for independence in '48. So that's the roots from which I come, and I talk about those in great detail. And many of my peers and many of you probably have connections in a similar way. It may be a direct family member, it may be friends, it may be cousins, but there was a sense as I was growing up that there was a very deep and personal connection, either to the State of Israel or even to World War II, to the fight for Israel, to the wars that were taking place. The connection, in a sense, was far simpler then, as I was growing up and as many of us were. We stood up for Israel in its fight for survival, in a clear David versus Goliath story. It was defined then in sharp shades of black and white, and that was the way in which we were raised on these issues. And those relationships and connections are remarkably different today for the next generations that follow, for my friends' kids, for the folks that I meet in college who are decades removed and generations removed from the experiences of World War II, from the experience of the founding and the creation of the State of Israel. And I spend a fair amount of time in the book exploring how, for those younger than me today, the connection to the experiences that my family had and to Israel, the way that I knew it, is far different, and it's understandably more distant. and some of the level of the gut emotional tie is lost. And I think that's extremely important to understand the dynamics of the American Jewish community today to see the generational shifts that are taking place. Today's younger Jews are being raised with, in this country in particular, an identity that is rooted in social justice. It is rooted in a sense of tikkun olam. It is rooted in a sense of democratic values, and it's rooted much less in a sense of nationalism and patriotism around the creation and the survival of the State of Israel. So a lot of these generational impacts are going to have a very big impact. A lot of these generational shifts are going to have a very big impact on our community and on American politics. And what exactly they mean, I would argue, and I do in the book, is still as yet unclear. And we have a lot of work to do to understand how all of that is going to play out. So that's the first part of the book, the personal story and putting the historical context to the politics today. So beyond telling that personal story, I then go on to talk about the three central challenges that I think are confronting Jews in America, the organized Jewish community, and friends of Israel as they deal with the complexities of Israel and the Middle East today. The first challenge is to face the fact that the path that Israel is on today is not sustainable. Israel has reached a point where it has to make a choice among three things. One is hanging on to all of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and specifically maintaining control over the West Bank and essential control over Gaza. Two is the country's democratic character and the values on which it was founded and that are enshrined in its Declaration of Independence. And three is its strong Jewish character as the national homeland of the Jewish people. But I argue, and I think it's a fact, that it can only have two of those three. Only by reaching a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on territorial compromise, based on creating two states for two peoples in that one land, can Israel really allow itself to be both a true democracy and live up to its Jewish values. And for those like me who care deeply about the future and the security of the State of Israel, that is why the creation of a Palestinian state and the establishment of a border that is accepted to the two sides and the international community between Israel and that state is such an existential necessity. And I'm very afraid that what we're watching right now is Israel gradually decide to sacrifice its democratic character and the very values of our people in order to hang on to all of the territory that it won in 1967. That's simply not going to be acceptable to the neighborhood in which Israel lives, particularly not at a time when movements for freedom and democracy are sweeping the entire region. And it won't be acceptable to the rest of the world either, because if Israel stays on its present course, it is going to become increasingly isolated and shunned until it changes its ways. And I think that that is the threat that is looming over Israel in the UN vote. It is what follows the UN vote in the International Court of Justice, in the International Criminal Court. So I am very, very concerned that the path that Israel is on today is leading it towards further conflict, towards isolation, and this time it is brought on not by outside forces, but by political decisions that Israel itself is making. And while recognizing that Israel's citizens must make their own choices, they are the ones whose sons, like Gilad Shalit, are putting their lives on the line. It is their choice. But I try to make the case in the book that it's not just our right, but it's our duty as Jewish Americans to do what we can to help our cousins in Israel to recognize that the course they are on is unsustainable before it is too late.